You are sitting on your sofa, perhaps shivering slightly because the draft from the window is hitting your neck. You reach for a remote to turn up the heat, or maybe you just pull a machine-made polyester blanket over your lap. It is a tiny, mundane adjustment. But here is the paradox. You are a tropical animal. Biologically, you are a hairless, thin-skinned ape designed for the sweltering heat of the African savanna. If I took you and dropped you into the Siberian steppe 30,000 years ago during the last glacial maximum, you wouldn't last 3 hours. You have no fur, no thick layer of blubber, and no hibernation reflex. Yet, against every biological law, your ancestors didn't just endure the most brutal winters in Earth's history, they conquered them. They took a world made of ice and turned it into a home. They survived the impossible not because they were strong, but because they learned how to outsmart the cold before it could touch their skin. If they hadn't, that blanket in your lap wouldn't exist, and neither would you. The thread of human history was almost cut by the frost, and the way we stitched it back together is a story written in bone, fat, and blood. The first thing you have to understand is that everything you've been told about our natural ability to survive the cold is a lie. There is a common myth that ancient humans were somehow hardier or physically tougher than we are today, as if their blood ran thicker or their skin was like leather. It's a comforting thought, but the science says otherwise. In 2014, researchers looking at the UCP1 gene, which helps mammals generate heat through brown fat, found that humans have a remarkably weak version of this compared to our cousins. We are, quite literally, one of the worst-equipped mammals for winter. While a woolly rhino has a hide several inches thick and a coat of hair like a carpet, you have a layer of skin less than 2 millimeters thick. We didn't adapt to the winter biologically, we adapted technologically. This is the first stitch in our thread of survival. We realized that our bodies were a failure in the frost, so we began to build a second, external body. But even with tools, the math of the Paleolithic winter was merciless. Imagine a wind chill of -60 degrees Fahrenheit. At that temperature, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Your lungs actually burn as you breathe, the moisture in your breath turning to ice crystals before it even leaves your lips. To a lone human, this environment is a death sentence. But for a group, it became a puzzle. The primary myth we need to dismantle is the lonely caveman trope. The idea of a rugged individual surviving the Ice Age is a Hollywood fantasy. In reality, the thread that kept us alive was woven from dozens of hands working in unison. If you were alone, you were dead. Survival required a social contract that was tighter than any we have today. You weren't just living with your family, you were living with a mobile library of survival knowledge, a communal heater, and a collective hunting machine. This biological thread of ours was fraying under the weight of the encroaching glaciers, but humans were about to stitch a new defense using the most powerful chemical reaction on the planet. We often think of fire as a simple campfire, something for roasting meat and singing songs. But in the brutal winters of the Pleistocene, fire was a sophisticated life support system. At the Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, evidence suggests our ancestors were managing fire as far back as 1 million years ago, but by the time we hit the deep freeze of the last ice age, fire management had become an art form. It wasn't just about heat, it was about thermal budgeting. Archaeologists have found hearths in ancient dwellings that were positioned with mathematical precision. They weren't in the center of the room where the heat would rise and escape through the roof. They were often placed near the back walls or in stone-lined pits designed to radiate heat back toward the sleeping areas. Think of fire as an externalized gut. By cooking meat, ancient humans were essentially predigesting their food. This is crucial because your body uses a massive amount of energy just to digest raw protein. In a winter where every calorie was a shield against hypothermia, you couldn't afford to waste energy on digestion. Fire allowed our ancestors to extract more energy from a mammoth steak than a lion could from the same piece of meat. This extra energy didn't go to their muscles, it went to their brains. It gave them the cognitive space to plan for the next month, rather than just the next hour. But fire was a jealous god. It required constant fuel in a landscape where trees were often scarce. This forced a level of planning that is staggering. Ancient groups had to map out fuel corridors, knowing exactly where the scrub brush or dried animal dung could be found miles before they reached it. If the fire went out in the middle of a 3-day blizzard, the thread was cut. There were no matches, and starting a fire in 90% humidity with frozen fingers is nearly impossible. You didn't just use fire, you guarded it like a living member of the tribe. But a warm fire needs a wall to catch its breath, a place where the thread of heat doesn't unravel into the night. This brings us to the most incredible architectural feat of the ancient world, the mammoth bone houses. For a long time, we thought ancient humans were just cavemen. But caves are fixed in place, and the herds moved. If you wanted to survive, you had to be mobile, which meant you had to carry your house with you, or build one out of the only material available on the treeless tundra. At the site of Kostenki 11 in Russia, researchers led by Dr. Alexander Pryor recently uncovered a massive circular structure made from the bones of at least 60 different woolly mammoths. This wasn't a pile of trash. It was a precision-engineered fortress. But even with the best plans, the winter was a psychological monster. Imagine being trapped in a bone house for weeks at a time, with nothing but the howling wind and the flickering shadows of the fur. The skulls were used as a foundation, buried in a circle to provide a heavy, unmoving base. Leg bones were stacked like bricks, and massive tusks were arched over the top to create a ribbed roof. This structure was over 30 feet wide. Now, consider the labor involved. A single mammoth femur weighs more than a human can easily carry. This required a coordinated construction crew. They didn't just throw bones together, they used local clays and mud to chink the gaps, creating a windproof seal. Inside these bone bunkers, the temperature could be maintained at a level where a human wouldn't just survive, but could actually sleep. This is a massive psychological advantage. If you are shivering all night, you aren't resting. If you aren't resting, your reaction time drops. If your reaction time drops, the next hunt is your last. These bone houses were the first step in humans taking control of their environment, rather than being victims of it. But even the best house is just a box if you don't have the fuel to run the engine inside. Within these walls, the thread of survival was tied to a different kind of fuel, the heavy, yellow gold of the animal kingdom. We have a modern obsession with lean protein, but in a brutal winter, lean meat is a poison. There is a medical condition known as rabbit starvation or protein poisoning. If you eat only lean meat, like rabbit or deer, without any fat, your liver cannot process the excess nitrogen. You will literally starve to death with a full stomach. Our ancestors knew this. To them, fat was life. This is why the woolly mammoth was the ultimate prize. It wasn't just about the mountain of meat, it was about the 4-inch thick layer of fat beneath the skin. This fat was more than just food. It was a multi-purpose survival technology. They rendered it down into tallow to use as fuel for stone lamps, allowing them to work and sew during the 20-hour-long nights of the Arctic winter. They smeared it on their skin as a primitive but effective barrier against frostbite and windburn. Most importantly, they stored it. In the permafrost of the Eurasian steppe, ancient humans discovered the world's first deep freezer. They would dig pits deep into the frozen earth, lining them with hides and packing them with fatty meat and bone marrow. Studies at sites in Ukraine show that these caches could hold thousands of pounds of food, preserved by the natural sub-zero temperatures of the ground. This meant that even if a blizzard lasted for 2 weeks, the tribe didn't have to hunt. They had a bank account of calories buried beneath their feet. This ability to delay gratification, to kill a massive animal in autumn and save half of it for February, is what separated us from every other predator. But the cold was always looking for a gap in the armor. That armor was made of something more delicate than bone or fat. It was made of a single, tiny invention that changed the course of human history: the eye needle. If you look at a Neanderthal, they were much more physically adapted to the cold than we were. They were stocky, with shorter limbs to retain heat and large noses to warm the air. Yet they went extinct and we didn't. But one of the leading theories points to the needle. Neanderthals likely wore capes, or draped hides, which were loosely tied. Humans, however, developed the bone needle, allowing us to sew tailored clothing. This is the most critical stitch in our thread. Tailored clothing means the garment is fitted to the body, leaving no gaps for cold air to circulate. It means sleeves, trousers, and hoods. At the Sungir burial site in Russia, which dates back about 34,000 years, archaeologists found the remains of individuals buried in what were clearly sophisticated, multi-layered suits. They weren't just wearing skins. They had inner layers made of soft furs, probably from small carnivores like foxes, and outer water-resistant layers made of treated reindeer hide. These clothes were decorated with thousands of ivory beads, but beneath the art was a thermal masterpiece. Each bead represented hours of labor, but they also added weight and wind resistance to the garments. The discovery of bone needles at sites like Denisova Cave, some dating back 50,000 years, tells us that while the glaciers were advancing, humans were busy perfecting the art of the seam. If your clothes don't fit, the wind steals your heat. If the wind steals your heat, you die. The needle was our greatest weapon against the Ice Age, more important than any spear. But as the winters grew longer, a new threat emerged, one that couldn't be stitched away. This threat was the invisible drought. This is the biggest reveal of the Ice Age mystery. We call it an ice age, but for the people living through it, it was actually a dust age. When the world's water is locked up in massive glaciers, the atmosphere becomes incredibly dry. The lush forests turned into what we call the Mammoth Steppe, a vast, cold, windswept grassland. The real killer wasn't just the cold, it was the lack of liquid water. If you eat snow to stay hydrated, you lower your core temperature, which can lead to hypothermia. Ancient humans had to solve the problem of thirst in a world where every lake was a block of granite. They solved this by becoming master hydrologists. They tracked the thermal properties of the landscape, finding springs that were fed by deep, geothermal heat or river bends where the current was fast enough to prevent total freezing. They also used their fire technology to melt ice, but this required even more fuel, creating a feedback loop of labor. This is where the thread of our metaphor becomes a web. You needed fat to have the energy to gather wood. You needed wood to melt the ice so you could drink. You needed to drink so you could stay hydrated enough to hunt more fat. If any part of this web broke, the whole system collapsed. The wow factor here is the sheer cognitive load. A Paleolithic human in winter was essentially a project manager, balancing a dozen different resource streams simultaneously. One mistake in the hydrological budget in November could mean a dead tribe in January. The threat wasn't just physical, it was mental. This is why we see a sudden explosion of art during the coldest parts of the Ice Age. The cave paintings in places like Chauvet or Lascaux weren't just pretty pictures. Many researchers believe they were a form of virtual reality, a way to stay connected to the animals and the sun during the long, dark winter. They were a psychological anchor. By painting the mammoth and the bison, they were asserting their dominance over the world outside. They were reminding themselves that the spring would come. This brings us to a counterintuitive fact. The brutal winter might actually be the reason we are so smart. The environmental complexity thesis suggests that the sheer difficulty of surviving these winters acted as an evolutionary pressure cooker. It forced us to develop language to coordinate complex hunts and social structures to share resources. It forced us to invent the needle, the lamp, and the freezer. We didn't become intelligent and then decide to move into the cold. The cold moved in on us, and we had to become intelligent to survive it. We are the children of the frost. Every technological leap we have made since, from the steam engine to the smartphone, can trace its lineage back to a shivering group of people in a bone hut, trying to figure out how to make it to Tuesday. However, there was one final secret to their survival, a biological cheat code that we are only just beginning to understand. It involves the way our bodies react to extreme cold over long periods. While we don't have the brown fat of a polar bear, humans do have a limited ability to acclimatize. If you are exposed to cold consistently, your body begins to shift its metabolic rate. Your blood vessels become more efficient at vasoconstriction, pulling heat away from your extremities to protect your core organs. Ancient humans likely lived in a state of permanent cold hardening. They weren't comfortable by our standards, but their bodies were tuned to a different frequency. They were able to function at temperatures that would send a modern person into shock. This wasn't a genetic change, but a physiological one, a testament to the incredible plasticity of the human form. We are the ultimate generalist species. We can't run the fastest, we aren't the strongest, and we have no fur, But we can adapt to any hell the planet throws at us as long as we have a needle and a spark. But the fire wasn't just a tool, it was a hungry god that demanded a sacrifice of time. And as the centuries turned into millennia, the winters began to recede. The thread of our story began to move south, then north again, following the retreating ice. But we never lost the lessons we learned in the dark. We kept the needles. We kept the fire. We kept the social contracts. And we kept the memory of the cold. It is encoded in our myths of Fimbulwinter and the White Walkers, a deep, ancestral fear of the time when the world went white and the animals vanished. We are a species that was forged in a freezer, and that forge made us the masters of the planet. As you look around your room now, you might see small things that remind you of this journey. That leather belt you're wearing? It's a direct descendant of the brain-tanned hides of the mammoth hunters. That bowl of soup? It's only possible because we learned to externalize our digestion 1,000,000 years ago. But there is one piece of evidence that is more haunting than the rest. In several Ice Age burial sites, archaeologists have found something tiny tucked into the clothing of the deceased. It wasn't a weapon or a piece of gold. It was a bone needle. Even in death, even as they were being sent into the great unknown, they were given the one tool that had saved them from the frost. It was a symbol of their defiance. It was a message to the future: we were here and we refused to freeze. The needle was the thin line between a species that survived and a species that became a fossil. Today, we live in a world where the cold is an inconvenience, something we view through a triple-paned window while the thermostat hums in the background. We have become so good at insulating ourselves that we have forgotten the math of the frost. We think we have conquered nature, but we are still the same hairless apes who nearly vanished 30,000 years ago. The only difference is the thickness of our walls and the complexity of our fire. If the grid went down and the fire went out tomorrow, how many of us would know how to stitch a defense against the wind? How many of us would know where the gold of the fat is hidden? We are the beneficiaries of a 200,000-year-long struggle, a relay race where the baton was a burning ember and a bone needle. Think about that the next time you feel a slight chill in your living room. That shivering reflex is a ghost from the Pleistocene, a warning from your ancestors that the thread of survival is always thinner than it looks. They did the impossible so that you could be uncomfortable at 68 degrees. They built a world out of mammoth skulls so that you could build a world out of silicon and steel. We owe our existence to a group of people who looked at a glacier and didn't see a wall, but a challenge. They were the first engineers, the first tailors, and the first master planners. They didn't just survive the winter, they owned it. And that bone needle, found in the dirt of a Russian grave, is the haunting, definitive proof. We are only here because they refused to let the thread break. Which part of their survival kit do you think you'd miss the most? The communal warmth of the fire, or the security of a house made of mammoth bone? Or perhaps more importantly, do you think we've lost that social thread that made their survival possible in the first place? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you found this deep dive into our frozen past fascinating, consider subscribing. We're going to be exploring more of these hidden chapters of the human story, and I'd love to have you along for the journey. It's a long way from the Ice Age to today, but the thread still holds. The bone needle found in that Siberian grave wasn't just a tool, it was a defiant shout across 30,000 years of ice. It tells us that while the glaciers were nearly a mile thick, the human spirit was thicker. Our ancestors were the only tropical animals to ever look at a polar landscape and decide to stay, not because they could change their bodies, but because they could change their world. They survived the brutal winters by turning a hairless ape into a master of fire and bone. And that small, ivory-beaded suit on a child's skeleton isn't just a garment, it is a cold, hard fact. We are a species defined not by our environment, but by our refusal to be limited by it. The frost tried to take us, and it failed because we learned how to stitch our own warmth. We are the survivors of the longest night in history, and we carry that fire within us still. Don't ever forget that you come from the strongest people who ever lived. The thread is in your hands now.